Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Almost no one ever bothers to read what they sign, not when it comes to student loans, not when it comes to mortgages, and certainly not when it comes to a trust fund. My ex-husband was so sure he was the mastermind of our son's financial future, but in reality, he had skipped over a detail so obvious it would eventually crush his pride. That detail put me in control, and until last night, even I had almost forgotten just how much control I actually had. The graduation party was supposed to be about Evan, and I went in knowing that no matter what happened, I would smile, stay calm, and keep my dignity intact. Still, when my own son lifted his glass, smirked in front of everyone, and asked why I was even there since I had never done anything for him, I felt something inside me lock into place. I did not scream, I did not throw my drink, and I did not storm out. I simply raised my glass, smiled at him, and let him believe he had won the night. What he didn't realize, and what nobody in that backyard full of relatives and neighbors realized either, was that I was already planning my answer, and it would not be spoken with words. By the time I drove home, I could feel my phone buzzing with the first comments, the first reposts of his little performance. Riley, his girlfriend, had already uploaded a clip with a caption that framed me as some kind of unwelcome guest. Mark, my ex, stood in the background of the video, smirking like this was the victory lap he had been waiting for. My mother-in-law, Diane, was shown clapping with that satisfied little expression that said she believed she had been proven right all along. But when I unlocked the small fireproof box in my closet and pulled out the thick binder of documents, I knew the performance was already over, even if they didn't see it yet. Years ago, when Mark was eager to set up the trust fund to prove his success, he signed every paper that the lawyer put in front of him, but he didn't read the fine print. He wanted to look impressive, so he nodded through the explanations and bragged later about how Evan would have security no matter what. He forgot that the agreement left one trustee with discretion until Evan's mid-20s, and he forgot that in the end, that trustee was me. He forgot because he wanted to forget, because he thought I would never use that power. I sat at the table and reread the pages I hadn't touched in years. There it was in black and white. Evan could not access the bulk of the funds without my written approval until he reached a specific age, and that age was still a few years away. The bank had instructions to honor my directives over his card, his withdrawals, and his disbursements. Suddenly his smug performance at the party seemed almost laughable. He had no idea that while he was mocking me for supposedly contributing nothing, I was the one holding the key to everything he thought was his. By morning, I had already drafted a short, sharp message to my friend Charisse, who happens to be an attorney. I told her I was ready to act, and she replied within minutes with the forms and the exact wording I should use with the bank. It took less than an hour to freeze the account and redirect the trust into a controlled mode. I instructed the bank to suspend Evan's card immediately and to send me direct approval requests for any future disbursements. Then I left a small card in the envelope on the kitchen counter, just 2 words, figure it out. By noon, I had 15 missed calls. By late afternoon, that number had doubled, and by evening, it was past 50. Evan tried calling, texting, sending voice messages. Riley sent screenshots of bounced charges and posted cryptic complaints online. Mark messaged me directly with a single line, "You do this, I go nuclear." I didn't respond. I poured myself a glass of water, turned my phone face down, and let the silence hang heavy in the air. Do you know what happened next when his card declined? That's the part nobody expected. When I woke up the next morning and looked at my phone, the sheer number of notifications made it almost comical, because it wasn't just Evan trying to reach me anymore, but Riley spamming with dramatic voice notes, Diane leaving clipped voicemails about how family matters should be handled privately, and even Mark switching between threats and pleas as if he couldn't quite decide which tactic would actually make me flinch. What none of them seemed to understand was that once I flipped that switch, once I finally decided that I wasn't going to sit quietly and let their version of the story go unchallenged, there was no undoing it, because I had more than feelings on my side. I had records, paper trails, and receipts that could dismantle every narrative they had built against me. Evan thought he had humiliated me with a smirk and a single sentence at his party, but humiliation only lasts as long as you allow it to sit unopposed. And I wasn't about to let people I had carried for years erase everything I had done just to keep up their image of me as absent, unhelpful, or unnecessary. I drove down to the university bursar's office and requested the full payment history, and the look on the clerk's face when she printed those pages was enough to remind me just how much I had stepped in over the years. There it was in black and white, tuition balances covered by me when deadlines loomed and Mark's payments hadn't arrived, emergency charges settled from my checking account, and stipends for books and meals quietly handled without fanfare. Every time Mark had promised Evan that Dad will take care of it, it had been me quietly transferring funds, me answering late-night calls, and me sacrificing my own security to cover a bill before enrollment could be dropped. I gathered health copay receipts too, the kind you forget about until you need them, showing how many times I had covered prescriptions and hospital visits when Mark's insurance card just happened to lapse or when Evan was still too young to argue about who paid. I didn't print them to gloat. I printed them because I was tired of living in a world where people looked at me like I was nothing but a bitter ex with no history of stepping up. Those receipts were my truth, and they spoke louder than any staged smirk at a graduation party. When I got home, I scanned every page into a single document and added a cover sheet with nothing more than dates, amounts, and the notation paid by Lena. No commentary, no emotional outburst, no angry explanations, just raw numbers lined up in a way that couldn't be dismissed as bitterness. Then, at the very bottom, I attached the clause from the trust agreement that confirmed what Charisse had already reminded me of, that I held discretionary power until Evan reached an age that he hadn't yet touched. I didn't need to scream, because the documents were screaming for me. By the time I finished compiling everything, Riley had uploaded another post, this one showing Evan looking frustrated at a diner, with the caption, "When family betrays you, you find out who's real." The comments poured in, mocking me, sympathizing with him, all of it built on the false idea that he had been cut off unfairly. What none of them knew was that the same kid posting for sympathy had been using the trust card for educational expenses that mysteriously included high-end sneakers and electronics, and now, thanks to a flagged note from the bursar's office, I had proof that some of those charges were not just irresponsible but outright prohibited under the rules of the trust. So when Mark finally sent another message, "Reverse this stunt, Lena, or I'll drag you into court and finish what I started years ago," I didn't type a long response. I simply attached the PDF of receipts, highlighted the section of the trust agreement that gave me authority, and added a single sentence, "Happy to discuss in mediation." He went silent after that, and for the first time in years, I could feel the ground shifting under his feet instead of mine. Of course, silence from Mark didn't mean peace, because Evan's calls kept coming, and this time they carried a different tone. He wasn't just angry now, he was panicking. The jewelry purchase that had tripped the system was being flagged, and the bank was preparing to demand an explanation. He didn't know that yet, but I did, and I knew exactly how that conversation was going to play out. Can you guess what happens when a trust account shows spending that the agreement specifically forbids? It isn't just declined charges, it's repayment demands, compliance checks, and the cold realization that the safety net you mocked your mother for not providing is actually the very thing keeping you from drowning. The silence that followed Mark's last message didn't feel like relief so much as it felt like a pause before the next storm, because I knew him well enough to understand that when he went quiet it wasn't because he had accepted defeat, but because he was recalculating, and in the meantime Evan's desperation was beginning to spill over into every corner of my life. With messages coming at all hours, voicemails left with that pleading edge that teenagers use when they realize their tantrums are no longer working, and frantic texts that made it clear he had no idea what the actual rules of his own trust even were. What he didn't realize, and what Mark either conveniently forgot or chose not to explain, was that the agreement we had signed years ago wasn't written to guarantee him free access to whatever he wanted. It was written to protect him from himself until he had lived long enough to understand that money isn't infinite, that it comes with conditions, and that it can disappear faster than it appears when you treat it like an open bar. Charisse came over that weekend, spread the documents out on my kitchen table, and with the calm patience only an attorney can maintain walked me through every clause that mattered. She pointed to the section that granted me authority to issue conditional disbursements tied to employment, service, or educational expenses, and she highlighted the paragraph that allowed me to demand repayment for any charges deemed non-essential or unrelated to schooling. She explained that I wasn't simply cutting Evan off out of spite. I was exercising the very role the trust gave me, the role of gatekeeper until he reached the age where the fund became his without restriction. In that moment, I realized I wasn't fighting against my son. I was fighting for the version of him that might still learn accountability before it was too late. The next morning, I drafted what I now call my conditions letter, and it was not written in the language of anger or punishment, but in the dry, precise style that banks and courts respect, because I wanted to make sure that no one could accuse me of being arbitrary or emotional. I wrote that in order for Evan to unlock monthly support, he would need to provide proof of either a real job or a structured volunteer service, that he would need to show a written budget covering essentials like rent, food, and transportation, and that any discretionary spending would be paused until he demonstrated consistent responsibility. I also added a repayment clause for the jewelry and electronics, spread out over a year, because I wasn't going to let him shrug off that misuse as if it were nothing. I ended the letter with one small olive branch. Pick any honest job, Evan, and I will match your first month's earnings. It wasn't a bribe, it was an incentive, a way of showing him that effort would be rewarded more than entitlement ever could be. When I sent the letter to both Evan and Mark, the reactions were as predictable as they were revealing. Mark threatened to petition the court, rattling off words like overreach and vindictive as if saying them out loud could change the ink on the trust agreement. Riley fired off a chain of angry messages about how humiliating it was for Evan to have to prove himself, like some ordinary kid, when he came from a family with resources. Evan, however, didn't know what to say at all. His responses flipped between outrage and bargaining, as if he were trying to test which approach would get me to cave first. But every time I looked back at the letter, I reminded myself that this wasn't about me being cruel. It was about me refusing to be manipulated into letting him fail in the long run. The bank backed me immediately. Within hours, the tuition balance was cleared with a transfer I had authorized, but the discretionary account was locked and restructured into a restricted format where it could only pay for verifiable essentials. That meant no late-night shopping sprees, no flashy electronics, no jewelry tagged on social media for Riley to pose with, and no easy cash withdrawals. Evan's card didn't vanish, but it transformed into something he had never experienced before, a tool that required responsibility, not a toy for clout. Of course, it wasn't long before the next crack appeared, and it was exactly what I had expected. A bank officer flagged a recent purchase, a piece of jewelry charged to the trust card just days before the freeze, and because the system cross-referenced expenses, it was automatically highlighted as a potential violation. The notice landed in my inbox like a gift, because it was the very thing that proved to everyone, including Evan himself, that my intervention wasn't arbitrary, it was necessary. He wasn't the victim of a cruel mother. He was the beneficiary of a trust that had rules, and those rules had consequences when broken. When I thought back to Smirked at the graduation party, I couldn't help but feel the sharp contrast between the boy who thought he could embarrass me in front of a crowd and the young man now facing the reality that every swipe of his card left a trail. It was almost poetic, but not in the way of pretty words or dramatic imagery, more in the sense that life had finally caught up with him in the form of his own signature on receipts he never imagined would matter. And now, with the misuse notice looming and the repayment clause ready to activate, I found myself asking the question that would shape the next step of this battle. What happens behind closed doors when you break trust rules? Because the answer was about to show Evan that the performance he gave at his party wasn't the final act, it was only the opening scene. When the misuse notice officially came through, the situation that had once been confined to family arguments and snide remarks at gatherings suddenly began to take on a much heavier weight. Because a trust violation is not simply a slap on the wrist or a warning from a parent, It is a matter of financial governance that requires documentation, repayment schedules, and the cold involvement of institutions that don't care about excuses. And while Evan was busy spinning his public story through Riley's posts about betrayal and cruelty, I was quietly positioning myself so that when the truth finally surfaced, no one could deny what had really happened. Riley, in her usual dramatic style, had turned Evan's frustration into content, posting filtered photos of him looking distraught at a diner, writing captions about how some people never want to see you succeed, and encouraging her followers to send heart emojis and comments of support. But what she didn't realize was that every one of those posts was only strengthening my resolve to let them keep talking while I prepared the receipts that would eventually dismantle their performance. I could have written my own public statement. I could have posted screenshots of tuition bills with my name on them or uploaded copies of the trust agreement that bore my signature as trustee, but I understood that silence often has more power than noise. Because the longer they talked, the more their story began to contradict itself, and the more people began to question why a young man with a trust fund was begging for sympathy on social media instead of simply proving responsibility and moving forward. Even Diane, who had been clapping the loudest at Evan's party when he mocked me, cornered me after church with that mix of suspicion and curiosity that only a seasoned gossip can manage, pressing me to explain what was really going on. And when I calmly handed her a copy of the jewelry receipt and the paragraph from the trust agreement that defined misuse, she had no choice but to lower her voice and admit that maybe, just maybe, things weren't exactly as Evan and Riley had been portraying them. At that point, I realized that I didn't need to fight a loud war. All I needed to do was let the right documents find their way into the right hands. I met with Pastor Jim, not because I was seeking permission or forgiveness, but because I wanted an outside perspective from someone who wasn't invested in winning or losing but in truth. He reminded me that boundaries are not cruelty, that sometimes the most caring thing you can do for a child is let them feel the discomfort of consequences, and his words steadied me as I prepared for the next step. Because this was no longer about locking a card or compiling receipts. This was about reputation, and reputation has the power to crush more deeply than money ever could. The more Riley pushed her narrative online, the more it backfired, because Evan's classmates began to ask questions. His professors quietly noted the contradiction between his public complaints and his private access to resources. And even Mark's colleagues began whispering about the mess spilling into company circles. One of them reached out to me anonymously, telling me that a senior manager had raised concerns after Riley tagged luxury brands in her posts, while simultaneously claiming that Evan had been cut off unfairly. And suddenly Mark's position at work was at risk, not because of anything I had said, but because his own son's and girlfriend's behavior had made the family drama impossible to ignore. Mark, who had once threatened to go nuclear if I didn't reverse my actions, now called me in a much different tone, urging me to ease up, not because he believed Evan deserved a second chance, but because his own reputation was starting to unravel at the office. That shift was all the proof I needed that I had chosen the right path, quiet, precise, and undeniable. I responded by filing a formal trust misuse notice, which froze discretionary privileges for a set period and put Evan on notice that he would need to present a plan before any further access could be considered. I then sent him a private message that contained no anger, no sarcasm, and no threats, just one clear invitation. When you are ready to fix this, I will meet you at the diner. Bring a plan, not a speech. For 2 days, there was nothing but silence. The calls slowed, the posts from Riley became less frequent, and even Diane stopped leaving messages. I knew the storm was shifting, I just didn't know which direction it would turn. And then, one evening, as I was clearing the table after dinner, my phone buzzed with a message from Evan. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock, the diner. Alone. When I walked into that diner the next day, I saw my son sitting by himself in a booth. No Riley at his side, no father hovering in the background, and no grandmother feeding him lines. He looked tired, almost deflated, and when I slid into the seat across from him, he didn't launch into excuses or insults. Instead, He placed a folded piece of paper on the table between us and said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him in years, "I think I messed up." Only a small percentage of people do this correctly, admit the truth and prove it, and in that moment, I knew the real turning point was finally within reach. When I sat across from Evan in that diner, watching him unfold the paper with hands that trembled slightly, I realized that for the first time in a very long time he wasn't performing for anyone. Not for Riley's camera, not for Mark's approval, not for his grandmother's validation, and not even for the strangers who had filled the comments on those social media posts with pity and outrage. He was stripped of the audience that had always given him an inflated sense of power, and what was left was just a young man who had finally collided with the consequences of his own choices. He admitted that the graduation party speech had been rehearsed, that Riley had encouraged him to make a statement, to gather attention online, and that he had agreed because he thought humiliating me in public would prove his independence. Instead, it had proven only that he didn't understand how the very structure of his trust worked, and that his arrogance had blinded him to the fact that I was the one person standing between him and complete financial collapse. I listened without interrupting, because I wanted him to hear his own words out loud, and then I slid the conditions letter back across the table and reminded him that none of this was about punishing him. It was about teaching him the lesson that money without accountability is poison. He looked at the repayment schedule, at the clause that demanded proof of employment or service, and at the offer I had made to match his first month's wages, and for once he didn't argue. He nodded, quietly, and said he was ready to start over. I knew better than to believe words alone, so I told him that what mattered wasn't what he said in that booth, but what he did in the weeks to come. True to his word, Evan applied for jobs, and when he was hired at a local warehouse for an entry-level position, he texted me a photo of his first pay stub, not with arrogance, but with something that resembled pride. I transferred the matching funds into his restricted account, and I reminded him that every dollar would be monitored, every expense reviewed, and every slip traced back to him. The jewelry and electronics he had purchased with trust money were placed under a repayment plan, deducted month by month, and he began to feel the sting of watching money he thought he had vanished toward debts he himself had created. Riley, who had been happy to flaunt trust-funded purchases on social media, quickly grew bored when the money slowed down, and within a month she had drifted out of his life, taking her curated sympathy posts with her. Mark tried one last time to pull strings, calling to suggest that maybe I was dragging this out for too long, but I reminded him that the misuse notice had been filed formally, that the bursar's office had documented his lapses, and that every path forward now required accountability, not manipulation. He had no answer to that, and the silence that followed was the final acknowledgement that his threats no longer carried weight. Evan, for the first time, was navigating without his father's promises or his girlfriend's spin, and though he stumbled plenty, he kept moving forward, one small paycheck at a time. 3 months into this new arrangement, Evan met me again at the diner, this time with a binder of his own. Inside were pay stubs, a budget he had written, receipts carefully sorted, and a repayment tracker that showed every deduction he had already made toward the jewelry purchase. He spoke less like a boy demanding what was his and more like a young man asking for guidance, and I knew then that locking the trust hadn't been cruelty, it had been the only act of love that could pierce through the noise surrounding him. I told him that because he had met his first milestone, I would unlock partial privileges, but I also told him that the trust would never again operate like a bottomless pit of money waiting to be wasted. Instead, I had restructured it so that a portion would go toward a practical goal in his name, and another slice would fund a scholarship for students who worked while studying, also under his name. The look on his face was a mix of surprise and something deeper, something that told me he was finally beginning to understand that legacy isn't about how loudly you perform success, but about how responsibly you live it. He asked me why I had gone that far, why I hadn't just left things the way they were, and I told him simply that entitlement dies only when you replace it with responsibility, and that I would rather see his name attached to opportunity for others than watch it dragged through the mud of reckless spending. As I walked out of that diner and into the evening air, I knew the story wasn't tied up neatly with a bow, because Evan still had years ahead of him to prove that he had truly changed, and I still had the authority to pull back privileges if he slipped. But in that moment, I also knew that the balance of power had shifted permanently, and that for the first time in years I wasn't the one standing in silence while others rewrote my role in his life. I had spoken in the language they could not ignore, the language of contracts, receipts, and consequences, and I had turned his public insult into a private lesson he would carry long after the noise died down. It broke him in ways that were necessary. It broke Mark's illusion of control, and it broke the story Diane loved to tell about me being nothing more than an afterthought. What I built in its place wasn't revenge for the sake of cruelty, but justice that was clean, sharp, and undeniable. And as much as Evan might hate to admit it now, one day he will understand that the moment his trust fund froze was the moment his life finally began.